So I want to talk about addiction. This is the end of a chapel series that we've been doing on addiction. If you've come to any of the previous chapels, if you came yesterday to Talbot Chapel, some of what I'll say tonight will be a repeat, but I want to talk about some new stuff too. The title of this series is Addiction, the Perilous Gift. And we do talk a lot about the perils and the dangers of addiction. I'm going to talk about that some tonight also. We don't talk as often about the gift that addiction can be. And so I want to direct our attention to that as well. And I want to talk about 7 myths that often get in the way of us understanding addiction well, of us knowing how to respond to it in our own lives or in the lives of our friends. And my hope is that something in what I say will help you think differently about your own tendency to addiction. It'll help you know better how to be a friend to someone who's struggling with an addiction. And also, my hope is that all of you, when you leave Biola, will become parts of churches. And this is an area that I think the church is not great at. And so I hope that you'll be part of helping whatever church you belong to know better how to think about addiction, how to talk about addiction. Before I get into the myths, sometimes people ask me, like, what is an addiction? How do I know I have an addiction? Here's the way I usually think about it. Typically, if you read any account of addiction, typically 6 or 7 marks or signs of addiction are given. They're not always put in order, but I think they can be ordered. And you'll see here on this slide, there's an arrow that points from an incipient addiction to a major addiction. Sometimes only some of these marks show up, but in any kind of major addiction, all of these marks are present. The first 3 are things that you probably hear about a lot when you talk about addiction: tolerance, withdrawal, and craving. Tolerance is when you need more and more of a drug or a certain kind of behavior to have the original experience that got you hooked. Withdrawal is the distress that your body feels in the absence of that drug, right? We all know what that is. Craving is sort of the flip side of that. If you're experiencing withdrawal, you want the object of the addiction. I might talk about substances. We usually think about substance addictions, but anything I have to say about addiction tonight also applies to what are called process addictions, addictions to certain behaviors like internet pornography or gambling, those sorts of things. Craving can be either physical. When you have physical craving, you can actually point to some part of your body that is hurting, like a headache, or you have shakes. Psychological craving just means that your desire for the addiction is paramount in your mind and you can't seem to get it out of the front of your mind. The next 4 marks of addiction are ones that we don't talk about as much, but I actually think they're more important. They're markers of more serious addictions. Ambivalence, we all know what that word means. It means you sort of have a sort of love-hate relationship with something. People in the grips of a major addiction feel simultaneously drawn to the object of their addiction and repulsed by it. If you've ever had an addiction, you know that the thing that you're addicted to, you want it, but you're also disgusted by it. You hate it in a certain way. This is true of any kind of major addiction. And relapse under ambivalence is one of the most paradoxical features of addiction. It's paradoxical that we can continue to do what we know is destructive to us and what we even in a certain sense hate. It's one of the hardest things to explain about addiction. The last 2, number 6 and number 7, I think are the characteristic marks of a major addiction. I think if you have these 2 things in your life, you have a major addiction and you need to seek help. The first is obsession. Alcoholics sometimes talk about what they call thinking drinking. What that means is that when you wake up in the morning, the first thing you think about is, where am I going to get my alcohol today? I'm going to slip out of this meeting. I have a bottle hidden in my office. I'll get a drink then I'll go to this other meeting. After that, I'll be able to drink. You plan your whole day around the object. If you have an addiction to internet pornography, when you wake up in the morning, you think about, when am I going to have a chance to be alone with a computer? That's obsession, thinking drinking. The last is denial. Well, everybody knows what denial is. Denial just marks the difference between your ideal of a good, flourishing life and the way your life is actually going. And the way we respond to that disconnect is we tell ourselves and others lies about how we actually live. If your thinking is characterized by obsession, and if your life is characterized by denial with respect to some behavior or some object, you have a major addiction and you need to seek help. Major addictions are not typically things that we can find our way out of without help. And there's all kinds of resources at Biola for you. It just strikes me now that I should say one of the myths that I'm not even going to put up on the screen, but is actually a myth. It's almost so obvious to me that I don't say it, but I want to say it to you now. If you're someone who's sitting in the audience and you have an addiction and you know you have one, there's a myth that you can't recover from addictions, and it's false. You can. You can. You just have to take a step. You have to do something. You cannot, probably if you have a major addiction, simply exert your willpower to stop doing what you're doing. The way you need to exert your willpower is by going to seek help. Okay? So now let's talk about some other myths. First myth, addicted people are especially immoral. This is an older way of thinking about addiction. It's what's called the moral model of addiction. I think popular culture has kind of helped us move beyond this, but it's still prevalent in the church. I think it's pretty obvious that addicted people are not especially immoral. If there are any distinguishing marks of people with major addictions, it's interesting, there have actually been studies on this. People with major addictions tend to be slightly more intelligent and slightly more creative than the general population. They don't tend to be more immoral generally. And you can see why that would be. Think about the things that drive people to addictions, things like anxiety, fear, trauma, victimization. The attempt to escape from these things are a basic human need. And addiction is what happens when a particular person, in response to a basic human need, runs into a substance or behavior that hijacks who they are, including hijacking their brain. Addicted people aren't especially immoral. There are many addicted people in this room. There are many addicted people at Biola. So the difference between addicted people and non-addicted people is not a line that runs through the Biola community. It's a line that runs through every one of us. It runs through every one of us. You might even think, yeah, it's true that we all struggle with addictions, but there are some especially bad people whose lives have actually been destroyed by addiction, and I would never end up on Skid Row destroyed by an addiction. I assure you that it's not because of your righteousness or your willpower that hasn't happened. It has lots more to do with circumstances. It has to do with where you come from. It has to do with the fact that you didn't run into the right substance at the wrong time in your life. So let's move past the moral model of thinking about addiction. The truth is that addiction runs through all of us, and most of us escape major addiction due to luck or circumstances. So don't be like this smug baby. He's such a jerk, right? Don't be smug, don't be condescending. Addiction is something that is part of all of us. It's a risk that we all run. Oftentimes, the only alternative to thinking about addiction as a moral problem is thinking about addiction as a disease. That's the most popular contemporary model for thinking about addiction. And if you were in chapel this morning, you heard that a little bit of a disagreement between me and Dr. Anna Lemke, who's the director of addiction medicine at Stanford. The disagreement is actually superficial. We agree at a much deeper level. I don't think of addiction as a disease, but I hesitate to even say that because there's so much that's been helpful about the disease concept of addiction. For one thing, it offers a genuine alternative to the moral stigma that has traditionally been attached to addicts. That's a good thing. For another, it has given motivation to try to understand the biological roots of addiction. Addiction has deep biological roots. It's simply true that if you are engaged in an addictive practice, your brain is different than it was before. It's so different that we can see it on imaging, brain imaging. It's also true that many of you have genetic predispositions to addiction. There are genes that predispose you to alcoholism. That's why certain addictions run in families. That's why certain racial makeups are less prone to fall prey to certain kinds of addiction. So addiction is deeply biological, and the disease concept has been helpful in directing our attention to that. The only reason that I resist the disease concept is that it prevents us from asking some important questions about addiction. Diseases are things that just happen to us, and they don't necessarily teach us anything deep about what it is to be a human being or about what our deepest needs or our deepest longings are, right? We don't say, somebody has polio. I wonder what that tells me about what human beings really need. But it is true that addiction tells us something important and deep about what it is to be a human being. And if we only think about addiction as a disease, then we don't ask that question. So sometimes I talk about addiction as a complex habit. This is why I'm not comfortable using the language of habit. Usually when we think of habit, we think of things like picking your nose or chewing your nails, right? Philosophers wouldn't have even called this a habit. They would have called this a disposition, and they would have distinguished it from a habit. This is not, we don't pick our nose because it helps us achieve some deep good. We just do it for some arbitrary reason, right? We started doing it. We don't usually, if we try to dig deep, no pun intended, I really did not mean to do that. I did not mean to do that. But if we try to dig deep into what picking the nose is all about, we're not going to get anything meaningful about being a human being, right? So this is why I say addiction is a complex habit. It is, I think of it as a really deep habit that is connected to all parts of what it is to be a human being. So addictions habituate our bodies. The body of an addicted person is different than the body of a non-addicted person. It habituates our thought life. We think differently because of addictions than we otherwise would. And it habituates our emotions. If you had to think of an example in the ballpark, you might think of something that we don't usually think of as a habit, but that really is a kind of habit. Think about the way racism works, right? Racism isn't a superficial habit. It's not something that you can get rid of overnight. And it deeply habituates a person in the way they see the world. You could exert your willpower not to be racist, and I assure you that because of the way that you've been raised and habituated, you have racist patterns that are deeply a part of who you are. Addiction is like that. It reaches into the deepest aspect of a human person. One of the helpful things about understanding habits is that all deep habits get entrenched exactly because they help us accomplish things that seem to be promising in the pursuit of happiness, human flourishing. So one of the questions that thinking about addiction as a habit can help us ask is, what is it that addictions help people do? Right? What is it that addictions help people do? If we think about addiction as a disease, we're inclined to think that it's a magical thing that happens whenever we come into contact with some kind of substance or process, and it's not. There's a myth that one hit will make an addict. That's not true. It's simply not true. It is true that the interpretation of one hit as meaningful can be the gateway to an addiction, right? So what has to happen is that the experience of a drug or a behavior meets some kind of need that a human person has. They can interpret this experience as a meaningful part of their life. That's what can open up the pathways to addiction. I don't know if you guys can see this, but this is an old propaganda poster against marijuana. It's from around the 1950s. And you can see in the upper right-hand corner, it describes marijuana as the burning weed with its roots in hell. It says some other interesting things. Up in the left-hand corner, it says, a puff of smoke started her on her way. And at the bottom, it describes marijuana as the deadly scourge that drags our children into quagmires of degradation. Your child may be next, okay? So I want to point out two things about this. One is the idea that one hit and you're done. That's a typical result of thinking about addiction as a sort of magical disease that comes from the outside and attacks you, right? The idea, if you think about the way that alcohol was described during the temperance movement, it was often described as the demon rum, right? The idea is that the demonic is somehow outside of us. That way of thinking actually prevents us from asking, what is it about us that makes us particularly drawn to these substances or behaviors? The other thing I want you to notice, this is a bit of a tangent, but I think it is important. Notice what kinds of fears this poster is capitalizing on. This is a young, attractive white woman. She starts with one puff, and she ends up, this guy's about to lay a big smooch on her, right? Throughout American history, I suspect this is true internationally, but it's certainly true in America, that all anti-drug campaigns have always capitalized on and been interwoven with the fears of a certain part of the population. They're often a form of propaganda. I'll give you an example. If I asked you to think right now of a drug dealer, it's simply true. Research shows that most of you right now have in your mind an image of a young black man standing on a corner. The fact of the matter is that there are far, far more white drug users and dealers in America than there are African American drug users and dealers. There's statistics that show this. The percentage of whites, blacks, and Latinos who use or sell drugs is almost identical, 6.4%, basically 6.4%. But almost all of us think, whether you're white or black, or Latino, most of us have an image of an African-American youth on the corner selling drugs. Why is that? It's because of the war on drugs and because of the way that the war on drugs was part also of a propaganda campaign. It capitalized on the fear that whites had of inner city crime. Now, this is a bit of a tangent, but I offer it to you because I want you to be aware of the way that the language of addiction and drug use in America is often part of a cultural strategy to pit particular peoples against one another, and you need to resist that. Addiction is absolutely equal opportunity. It's not a magical thing, it is equal opportunity, and it can happen to any of us because we're human beings. So if addiction only happens because a certain kind of experience meets a need that we have, what's the nature of the needs that addiction helps us meet? Here's another myth, and I think this is the single biggest myth about addiction, that addiction is about pleasure. Addiction is not about pleasure. That's not what addiction will give you. I'm going to read you I could read hundreds of stories like this, but I'll read you a story of the first time that this particular alcoholic experienced alcohol. I read this yesterday in chapel, but I'll read it again. This is from the Alcoholics Anonymous Big Book. This person describes his first interaction with alcohol. Everything changed, he says, with my first drink at the age of 16. All the fear, shyness, and unease evaporated with that first burning swallow of bourbon straight from the bottle during a liquor cabinet raid at a friend's party. I got drunk, blacked out, threw up, had dry heaves, and I was sick to death the next day. And I knew I would do it again. For the first time, I felt part of a group without having to be perfect to get approval. Now ask yourself, what attracted this person to alcohol? Was it sensory pleasure? No. This person got sick, blacked out, threw up, and was sick to death the next day. There's nothing pleasurable about that, right? Would you buy an entree every day if every time you ate it you got sick and blacked out? No. Think about what was attractive to him about the drug. It made him feel that he belonged. It enabled him to escape anxiety. It enabled him to escape fear. It made him feel at ease in his own body. Those are not sensory goods. Those are not pleasures, right? Those are deep moral and spiritual goods. So the reality is that addiction is about moral and spiritual goods. The first time I started thinking about this was when a friend of mine in graduate school, when I was just beginning to study addiction, he had been a paramedic, and he told me about the first time he went on a trip to a heroin overdose. He arrived, and the man was slumped over in the corner of his apartment and looked just like this, the accoutrements of heroin use everywhere. The apartment was an absolute wreck. And my friend's comment to me was, it was the first time I felt like I really knew what worship looked like. Strange comment, right? But his point was that this person had been willing to give his whole life for something that promised him so much that he was willing to die for it. Are you willing to die for pleasure? No, not willing to die for pleasure. The reason that people will give up everything for addiction is because addiction holds out the promise to give us things that we need in a very, very deep way. I want to read one of the privileges of having written about addiction is that people read what you wrote in the strangest, most surprising places. This is a letter that I got from a young woman in prison. She and her boyfriend overdosed on heroin, and her boyfriend died because of it. And because she had purchased the drug, she was charged with his murder, and she was in maximum security prison in Lincoln, Illinois. And she wrote me this letter. And I just want to read to you one part of her letter. She thanked me for writing the book and said that she felt like what I had said about addiction being about deep goods was something that she had tried to communicate to other people and had been unable to. And here's what she says about her and her boyfriend, she and her boyfriend. Neither of us, she says, had anything but contempt for society's values, and we felt no connection to anything but each other. We were disgusted with the plastic, airbrushed, superficial perfection that is the American ideal. This was a college graduate, by the way. You can tell she writes beautifully. She says, so our pale, anemic, track-marked flesh became a mark of distinction that separated us from all of that crap. We were not ashamed of being addicted to heroin in and of itself because we took a certain amount of pride in our deliberate choice to live in opposition to that superficial ideal. And the reason I read that to you is because I think what that suggests is that if you want to be yourself a person and part of a community that's capable of offering a genuine alternative to the addicted life, you have to be deeper than the superficial, airbrushed American dream, right? And that means that you're going to have to be vulnerable, right? You're going to have to be people who are able to show your brokenness. There's nothing so devastating for a church that wants to care for addicted people, which is all of us, than the attempt to appear perfect, whole, and healthy, right? So another important myth, I think, is that recovery is a ministry of the church. Recovery is not a ministry of the church. The church is a recovering community. If you think of recovery as a ministry of the church, that does two things. One, it suggests that there are some people in the church that need recovery and others that don't. And two, it suggests we can do recovery at a separate event, and that means on Sunday morning we can show up and we don't have to deal with recovery. Right? As I said in chapel yesterday, the kind of church that you want to go to, the kind of church that's capable of actually helping addicts recover, is a church that's going to look a lot more like a 12-step meeting than like a suburban book club. It's going to be ugly in lots of ways. And you all, and I believe this because I've gotten to know you as students, many of you want to be part of communities like that. And I promise you that when you leave here, it's going to get harder and harder to want to be in communities like that. You're going to have more and more to lose, for one thing. So the temptation for you is going to be to gradually drift into a kind of church that looks just like the airbrushed, perfected American dream that this particular heroin addict said was something that she knew that there was something deeper than that. And addiction offered her something deeper than that, but it killed her boyfriend and took her own life, right? So recovery is not a ministry of the church. Recovery is something that the church is about. Of course, the church is about more than recovery, right? Recovery means returning to some previous state. The church is about more than that. The church is about new creation. But the church is at least about recovery. If recovery is not happening in the church, there's no hope that the church will be a place where addicted people can be helped, where we can be helped. And this is true of the Biola community too, right? Two more myths related to this notion of a church that's inadequately honest to really help us escape addiction. First, addicted persons just need to pray more. Lots of religious folks say this to addicts. I've known people who are addicted, and they say, and I talked to the people in my church about it, and they said, you just need to pray more. Of course, prayer is important. Prayer is, in fact, a part of most programs of recovery. If you go to a 12-step group, prayer is part of that. So I believe in prayer, right? But very often, when we say, you just need to pray more, it's because we don't know what else to say. You don't have to say anything. When your friend or someone you know says they're struggling with an addiction, you don't have to say anything. Or you can just ask a simple question like, how did it start? Ask them to tell you their story. The reality is that addiction is neither purely biological nor purely spiritual. Bring some levity into this. Okay, last myth. The last myth is something that I'm not sure is a myth, but I want to share something from my own life that may be helpful to some of you. I think at places like Biola, in most Protestant settings, one of the most common attempts to create relationships that are capable of helping people deal with addictions is to have accountability relationships. I hear that word a lot. When I was in college, I was part of an accountability group of guys, you know. We got together to talk about various struggles, almost inevitably sexual sin, right? Seems to be what happens on Christian college campuses. I'm not a critic of accountability groups or friendships, but I want to suggest some of their shortcomings and suggest an alternative if you've been part of these and they don't seem to be helping you as much as you thought. Sometimes the way accountability friendships are set up is like this. If I have an accountability friendship, say with Logan, right? My hope is that my fear of disappointing Logan is so great that it will outweigh my urges to do bad stuff. That's the way accountability is supposed to work. The problem with that is that addicted people do mess up. They mess up a lot. And we're human beings, so that means that every time I mess up, I feel the disappointment of Logan. And Logan knows that it hurts me to be a disappointment to him. And so there are two strategies that we take. The most typical strategy is, I'm so tired of disappointing Logan, I don't have to tell him about this mess up, right? The other strategy is Logan knows that it's hurting me to be a disappointment to him, so he tries to minimize the seriousness of what I'm doing. And he says, hey man, we all suck, you know? And so we gradually become cynical. So if you've been in accountability relationships, you know these two temptations happen, right? You either start withholding more stuff, or you find yourself getting more and more cynical together. That's all a strategy for dealing with the fact that we are disappointing one another interpersonally. It's because accountability relationships tend to be horizontal relationships. Here's what I tried with a friend that has helped me tremendously. And we learned this by thinking about Roman Catholic practice of confession. This is what happens whenever I make a mistake, do something I know I shouldn't do, get drawn into a pattern that I know is not conducive to my health or my flourishing. It's really simple. I used to go to my friend, but now my best friend, the person that I do this with, lives in Illinois. I call him on the phone, and I say, I have to confess. And he says, okay. And I say, here's what I did. I describe what I did. And he says, you're forgiven. And I say, thank you. And we move on. That's it. I don't have to explain myself. I don't have to rationalize why I did what I did. I don't have to make big promises like, this is the last time, please hold me accountable, this is the last time. I confess. He doesn't forgive me. He reminds me of God's forgiveness, and we move on. And what's so great about that is every time I confess to him, I don't think that I'm disappointing at him at all, and he has no psychological burden to make me feel okay about it. All he has to do is to remind me that God is a forgiving God. And what that does is it relieves me of the burden of feeling that I disappoint him, and it reminds me that the heart of the problem, the reason that I care about this is that ultimately it cuts me off from God, and I don't believe that I can live a life of flourishing and wholeness cut off from God. It's a simple practice, but it has helped me tremendously. And if you're someone who's struggled with accountability relationships and not helping you in the way you thought they might, try the practice of confession. So addiction, is it a perilous gift? This is a picture of a coal miner and a canary in this cage. And coal miners used to take canaries in cages down into the mines with them. And the reason is that if poisonous gases began to seep out in the coal mine, the canary would die first, right? So you keep an eye on the cage over there, and if you see that thing keel over, you know, we got to get out. The poisonous gases are leaking. Addictions are a little bit like that. Right? Addictions and addicted persons in our midst always help us understand that there's risk everywhere, and communities that don't provide access to the kinds of things that human beings need to flourish, access to genuine friendship, access to experiences of God and an understanding of God, access to a deep identity and purpose that gives them a sense of who they are. Communities that are lacking those things are always communities that have high rates of addiction. And so addiction is perilous because it will damage you, it will hollow you out, and it can even kill you. But it's also promising because addiction should force us to ask ourselves, what are our deepest needs? And our deepest needs are for a life of purpose, a life of integrity, a life of ecstasy, meaning being part of something bigger than ourselves, and a life of fellowship and friendship. And that's ultimately what we are destined for. It's because our destiny is for those amazing things that we're drawn to anything that promises those kinds of ecstatic goods.
Biola University prepares Christians to think biblically about everything, from science to business to education and the arts. Learn more at biola.edu.